the Japanese could be very cruel, but they could also be very kind, you know. So it was like, for example, once my father and I, my mother and I were walking along a road, and we walked past what was a Japanese officers' club, and there was a Japanese soldier as a sentry with a bayonet. And when my mother and father walked past, they bowed to him, but they didn't bow low enough. So he got really annoyed that they were rude to him for not bowing low enough. So at bayonet point, he forced them to kneel on the ground, you know. And so it was all sharp little stones. So my father and mother were leaning on the ground, kneeling on the ground, and I was standing there. And the Japanese officers came out to see what was happening. They saw my father and mother kneeling. They saw me, and I had golden hair. And the Japanese love golden hair. You know, if they pat a golden hair, it's good luck. So they all started patting on the head, biscuits and all that. And there I was eating biscuits while my poor old parents were kneeling. So, you know, it's...
By the end of 1935, the young revolutionaries fleeing from Chiang Kai-shek finally reached the stronghold in Shanxi. The journey took them over a year to complete. After passing through some of the most deadly terrains of China, they lost 90% of their troops. One man ascended to power during this retreat. He and his supporters would become the party's new leaders in the following decades. His name was Mao Zedong. About 3 years later, a 10-year-old boy joined Mao's army. Born to a Russian mother and a Chinese father, he lost his parents at 4 and was adopted by a Chinese family. They named him Lin Gensheng. After he joined the Red Army to fight the Japanese, his army officer renamed him Lin Hu, the forest tiger. The young boy would become a career soldier, take part in every war fought by Mao, and play an indispensable role in the rivalry of East Asia.
Fear spreads throughout the world. Fear of aggression. Fear of invasion. Fear of revolution. Fear of death.
Because they were always poor because of my grandfather with his gambling, what do you call it, addiction. She used to say that, you know, for instance, my grandmother would get her secondhand shoes, which would be too big for her, and she'd have to stuff newspaper in to be able to walk properly. And she used to feel like a duck with all these big shoes that, you know, they weren't her size, but she had to wear them. And she never felt like she belonged.
Lila's family arrived in Shanghai in 1923. Her mom made a living teaching piano, and her dad tried many things. He worked on ships and opened a restaurant, but had a gambling problem and lost often.
I think she lived somewhere near Bubbling Well Road. She said that Daddy used to meet her bus when she'd come back from work. He'd be waiting at the bus stop and not saying anything to her because he didn't know her properly. And then he'd follow her, and they'd go through, she had to go through a graveyard to her house, and he'd follow behind. And I just have this idea of my father stalking my mother. That's crazy. Oh, dear.
George quickly began to court her, and the rest was history. As life was getting better for the young couple, the war cloud was darkening. In July 1937, Japan launched an all-out attack on China. The Japanese scored major victories within a month, capturing Beijing and controlling most of northern China. They began to move south quickly. On August 13th, the war reached Shanghai. The Japanese generals expected a quick victory, boasting that they would occupy Shanghai in 3 days, and China itself would surrender in 3 months.
You have seen in the pictures, and you have read of the destruction of homes and the terrible slaughters being carried out by the Japanese throughout our country, wherever their bombers could fly.
To everyone's surprise, Chiang Kai-shek put up determined resistance. Instead of 3 days, the Battle of Shanghai lasted over 3 months. The Chinese fought bravely, but eventually lost the battle, suffering 200,000 casualties.
My brother was born in Shanghai in 1935. And then in 1937, my mother was pregnant with me as she was carrying me. And the Japanese attacked Shanghai in 1937.
During the Battle of Shanghai, the international settlement continued to be administered by the Europeans and was largely untouched. Nevertheless, it caused widespread confusion and misery among Chinese and foreign populations. While other Shanghai expats began sailing home, the stateless Russians were heading further south to British Hong Kong. Paul's father, who had witnessed the atrocities committed by the Japanese army in the Russo-Japanese War, did not wish to live under Japanese control.
When the Japanese were attacking Shanghai, he somehow found a ship, a tramp steamer, that was going from Shanghai to Hong Kong. So he, my mother, my brother were on the ship. They arrived in Hong Kong. When they got to Hong Kong was in a panic because a lot of Chinese refugees were pouring into Hong Kong to escape from the Japanese advance. And the British, there was cholera, there was typhoid, and the British didn't know what to do and so on. So they said to my father, look, you haven't got a visa. You didn't apply for a visa. You can't just come into Hong Kong. You have to go back to China. Don't go to Shanghai. Go to Canton, which is Guangzhou now. Go to Canton and apply for a proper visa and so on. And my father said, oh, okay, fair enough. But just then, my mother, whoop, whoop, whoop. It was me coming. So they rushed her to Matilda Hospital and I was born. So I was the only British in the family. The others didn't have passports or anything, but I was British from birth.
Hong Kong was established as a colony of the British Empire after the Qing Empire ceded Hong Kong Island at the end of the First Opium War in 1841. The colony expanded to Kowloon Peninsula in 1860 after the Second Opium War, and was further extended to new territories in 1898. Like Harbin, Hong Kong was originally a sparsely populated area of farming and fishing villages. With the arrival of the British, The territory has quickly become a significant financial center and commercial port.
My father had written to the Hong Kong hotel and they offered him a job, so that's why he left. And my mother obviously came with him, and they left their families behind.
In November 1937, George and Lila also left Shanghai to stay away from the war. They boarded a steamer, Checksum, and arrived in Hong Kong. George got a job offer to work with his orchestra at all the main hotels. It was a busy life. Some weekends he would travel out to Repulse Bay for tea dances, and other weekends he would play at the Hong Kong Hotel, the Gloucester or Peninsula, and some night concerts. For George and Lila, it was a relief to come from war-torn Shanghai to a peaceful town with gorgeous scenery, lovely beaches, and a cosmopolitan crowd. Unlike George, Paul's family didn't have the paperwork to enter Hong Kong. As a result, the tram steamer took the family to Canton after Paul's mom was released from the hospital.
So we were then in Canton, Guangzhou, but I'll call it Canton. And my mother, to make some money and so on, she started a dressmaking business. And this was the good time because in England, Edward had abdicated the King Edward had abdicated the throne. His brother, George or Albert, was going to become George VI and so on. And so there were lots of celebrations in Canton because all the Europeans there, no matter what nationality, they were going to have a good time, a good party. So my mother was flat out working for all these things.
Meanwhile, the Japanese troops were moving southward quickly, taking every city on its way. In 1938, the Japanese bombers reached Canton, and Paul's mom began to worry.
My mother, she also was very religious. She was Russian Orthodox and very religious. So she was scared because if the Japanese were bombing Canton then, and if I was killed, according to their religion, I would go to limbo, which is not a good place to be. So she wanted to get me baptized, because if you want to go to heaven, you have to be baptized. So she sent my father to find the Russian Orthodox priest to baptize me. And there was only one in Canton. My father found him, and it turned out to be his worst enemy in the seminary back in the Ukraine. So my father said, no way, I'm not going to allow this guy to touch my son, because in the Russian Orthodox, they put the baby underwater. He says he'll drown him, I'm not going to let him do it. So my mother was very worried, but she had lots of customers, and one of her customers was a French woman who was Catholic, and she was married to a French banker. When I say banker, he owned the bank. He wasn't the person he owned the bank. He was, they're well off and so on. And she said to my mother, look, it's all the one God. Why don't you baptize him as a Catholic? My father was an atheist. He says, yeah, who cares about, get him baptized and so on. So I was the only Catholic in the family. So I was the only British, I was the only Catholic. And that helped us a lot during the war.
After the layover in Canton, Paul's father managed to get the visas for the family to return to Hong Kong. George also managed to get his mom and stepfather to Hong Kong by October 1939. Within the same month, his first child was born at Matilda Hospital. Her name is Lindy. As the reunited family celebrated Lindy's arrival, the war clouds darkened again.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
On December 8, 1941, the same morning as the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong, without declaring war on the British Empire. Japan had a massive advantage on land, sea, and air. But the next day, the defenders had been forced back to the gin drinkers' line.
帝国の流体、東亜の荒廃、まさにこの一戦にある。一億国民が一切を挙げて国に報い、国に準ずるの時は今であります。発行を家となす公募のもとに、この人中報告の大精神ある限り、英米といえども何ら恐るるに足らないのであります。勝利は常にニーズのもとにありと確信いたすものであります。
The other troops resisted bravely, suffering severe casualties and inflicting punishment on the invaders. It took the Japanese 9 days of hard fighting before they eventually crossed over, landing on the island's northeastern side. Yet, after 17 days of brutal fighting, General Maltby advised the governor that further resistance was futile. The American fleet had been decimated at Pearl Harbor, and the British had lost 2 of their capital ships to the Japanese bombers off Malaya. The defenders of the colony were on their own. On Christmas Day of 1941, Hong Kong surrendered.
I know it was quite hard for my parents in Hong Kong because they were considered third nationals. So they weren't put into camp. They just had to fend for themselves. And, you know, I remember Mummy telling me that when my father used to go off in the evening to play, they'd wonder if they'd see each other again. So it wasn't very pleasant.
Under the Japanese reign, stateless Russians in Hong Kong were considered as third nationals. Like in Manchukuo, they were somewhat favored by the Japanese regime. Unlike the British and Americans, who were either executed or imprisoned, Russians were mostly left alone, and many collaborated with the Japanese.
Many of the Russians, they didn't think it was a bad idea to work for the Japanese during the war, because the Japanese weren't fighting the Russians, either the White Russians or the Red Russians. So the Russians were neutral as far as the Japanese are concerned. So the Russians didn't think that they were collaborators. They just said, well, we had British colonial government. Now we have a Japanese colonial government. So we have to survive. So a lot of Russians actually worked for the Japanese in different ways and so on, and they didn't suffer as much. My father, as I said before, he hated the Japanese because of the 1905, so he refused to work. But in fact, my mother, my brother, and I, we begged, "Oh, Papa, please go work for the Japanese. We need to have food, And he said, "No." So he was very, very stubborn, So, but a lot of our Russian friends were quite happy to work for the Japanese, and they didn't suffer any consequences after the war because they were not considered collaborators, because they were in that no man's land. They were stateless, So it didn't mean anything.
During the Japanese occupation, an estimated 10,000 Hong Kong civilians, along with thousands of European soldiers and nurses, were executed, while many others were tortured, raped, or mutilated.
We lived there for 3.5 years under Japanese occupation. Everybody suffered, but the Chinese suffered a lot. I mean, when I was a kid, when I was 5 years old, I saw a Chinese man having his head chopped off in Nathan Road, and then a few months later, I saw a Chinese woman baned to death by a Japanese soldier, So it's so terrible things.
The Japanese army commandeered the peninsula as their headquarters and renamed it the Toa Hotel. And the Repulse Bay Hotel was renamed the Midorigahama Hotel. George didn't play at either hotel during the war. Hong Kong Hotel and the Gloucester Hotel were the only old places he played at. Sometimes he played at a Japanese officers' club, and if he didn't know a particular song, the soldiers used to beat him with the back of their swords. Several times, George would stagger into the flat with a bloodied back in the early mornings. His payment for playing at that club was a bowl of rice. Despite having his back flayed by some Japanese officers, George had met some decent Japanese who tried to do whatever they could to help his family. Paul also met a Japanese who provided his family with tremendous help during the war.
Before the war, we lived in an apartment in Kimberley Road in Hong Kong, in Kowloon. But I think both of my parents were working and they were making good money before the war. My father was, apart from mining, he was also working for the British government, building air raid shelters and so on. And my mother had a good dressmaking business, so they were then put money down, and they had bought a flat in Ashley Road. So when the Japanese occupied Hong Kong, we went, the whole family went to Hong Kong Island. My father worked for a company called Marsman, which built the air raid shelters for the British government, and they set aside one shelter for their senior employees and their families, and so we were there. And then when we went back to try to go back to the Kimberley Road flat, we were stopped by the Kempeitai, the Japanese secret police, and they wouldn't let us go into our flat in Kimberley Road, and all our possessions were there. My mother left everything there, So we then had to live in the flat that we owned, which was 5 Kimberley, and we then lived in one room, and all the other rooms my family rented out to other Russian families to make some money to survive. And our room was in the back, away from the street, overlooking like a hole, and right across from where we were, right across there, the windows was another flat, and that flat was used by the Japanese army as a brothel for corporals and sergeants, for non-commissioned officers. And it was, it was an awful thing. But my brother and I was only 4, I was 4 or 5 and he was 6 or 7, and we would look there, my mother would grab us and pull us away from the window so as not to see, and so on. So it was pretty horrible.
Almost every night, drunken soldiers would come knocking on their door, and Paul's father would indicate to them in sign language that the brothel they were looking for was next door.
This used to happen fairly regularly, and one day, knock on the door, he opened it, and there was this young Japanese, but he was an officer, a little lieutenant, a little, and my father, first of all, said, no, and he just smiled and he just shook his head and so on. He obviously wasn't interested in brothel, so my father didn't know what to do, and he didn't want to slam the door on a Japanese officer's face. That would have been a big mistake. So he left the door open and he went back to the room, and this Japanese officer followed in the room. And my mother said, what? But, being a Russian woman and so on, she said, would you like some chai, some tea and so on? So he smiled, So he didn't speak any English at all, and we didn't speak any Japanese. So he just sat there smiling away and all that. And we have tea and so on. And he after a while, he went away. And a few days later, another knock on the door. My father opened it. It was another officer, but much more senior. And he said, shh. He came in and he said, look, it's very embarrassing. My friend who came here, yesterday, he is a young man. He's very homesick, and he likes being in your company because it reminds him of family and so on. Would you mind not telling anybody? He's not supposed to fraternize with Europeans, He's a Japanese officer, but he, could you just keep it quiet and, no worries at all. So, very happy.
He became a regular visitor, and Poe's family started to enjoy his visits, especially as he always brought sweets for the brothers. The young man was very polite and would always nod his head enthusiastically, even though he didn't have a clue what Poe's family was talking about.
My father was getting really angry with the Kempeitai because the Kempeitai wouldn't let us go to old Kimberley Road flat to get all the stuff. And he started to talk in broken English to this young Japanese officer. And he went on for days and days and days. And somehow, this Japanese officer, Kempeitai. Foolishly, he grabbed my father. He dragged him to Kempeitai headquarters. Holding his arm, he brought him into a Japanese senior officer. And when the Japanese senior officer saw him holding this man's hand, this European's hand, he barked an order, and this poor old, his face all went, and he went away. And but because my father had been brought by a Japanese officer, he was very polite. He said, why are you here? And my father explained, all our stuff is in Kimberley Road. We can't get it because, every time we go there, we're not allowed to go in, blah, blah. And the Japanese officer said, all right, don't worry. Tomorrow, you and your family, you go there. Everything of yours will be on the street. So I said, oh, thank you very much. So we went there the next day, and true enough, everything. So we had to carry everything in a pram back to what's the name. And that helped us a lot because you could sell old things and so on. Anyway, the young Japanese officer never turned up again. And but a few weeks later, the older officer came along and explained that he had been ashamed, and he was given the choice of committing harikiri or volunteering to go to New Guinea to fight. So he went to New Guinea, and who knows what happened. So there was, and he was a really nice man, and he just disappeared. So.
New Guinea proved to be a bloodbath for the Japanese. Out of 350,000 Japanese soldiers who were sent to New Guinea, more than 200,000 died.
We in China, like you, want a better world, not for ourselves alone, but for all mankind, and we must have it.
By the summer of 1945, the tide of war had turned. On August 6, 1945, the United States detonated an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. 16 hours later, Truman called again for Japan's surrender.
We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware.
Late in the evening of August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. And soon after midnight on August 9th, the Soviet Union invaded Manchukuo. Hours later, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Six days later, Japan surrendered. The puppet state didn't last long after that. Manchukuo quickly collapsed in front of the Soviet army. 3 days after Japan surrendered, the 39-year-old Puyi abdicated once again. Hours later, he was arrested by the Soviet Union. Along with Puyi, the Red Army captured more than 600,000 Japanese soldiers and occupied Manchuria for 9 months. A year later, Puyi was put on trial.
Mr. President, the witnesses in court will now be sworn. You are now called to testify as a witness in this case now before the tribunal.
说的一切都是实验，实在的。
这个叫溥仪，本来是这个满洲姓，是爱新觉罗，爱新觉罗溥仪。I was born in Peking. My name is Puyi, and the Manchurian last name is Aishin Zhelo. 09年的时候，做这个中国的皇帝的这个地位。1909, I was enthroned as Chinese emperor. 1911年，在中国发生这个内部的一种的这个革命。啊，这个。Yeah. 1911, revolution started in China.
After the Japanese left and before the Soviets arrived, all hell broke loose in Manchuria. Shan Tianfang, the most famous Pingshu performer in China, was 10 years old and witnessed everything.
小日本的也跑光了，伪满洲政府也垮了台了，老百姓爱干什么干什么，完全处于无政府状态。哪知道消停了没有几天，开始抢上了，抢日本人的东西。因为日本人虽然跑了，东西带不走那么多，他们把门窗都锁上了。有人发现这屋是空房，日本人原来在这住过，就破门而入，那些东西随便拿，也没人管，也没人追究。一家被砸开，10家被砸开，所有的日本家几乎全都被砸开了。老百姓一天闲着没事就是拿东西，左一会儿右一会儿，你到街上一看没别的，全是搬运日本东西的。有一次我们走到七马路，我就听见有人喊：“接住！前面是日本鬼子，把他接住，把他打死！鬼子！”我抬头一看，可不是吗？顺着马路一前一后跑来俩人，看年纪在25、6、30上下，都光着脚丫，拼命的在头前跑。在后边追来一伙中国人，能有15、16个，手里都掐着棒子、铁条，拼命的在后头追。当时大街小巷这种现象不是少见的，因为人们恨透了日本人。见着就把他打死，好出气解恨。这两个跑的人从我们面前通过呀，我看得清清楚楚。他们俩跑出去也就50米左右，突然骑马路旁边有个胡同，从胡同里头又窜出一伙中国人来，手里头也掐着棒子和武器，就把这两个人给截住了。结果被两伙中国人给围在当中。 棍棒齐举啊，拼命地往下砸，也就是几秒钟的时间就结束了。我们这些小孩仗着胆子到了事发地点。刚才跑那俩人跑得挺快，现在老实了，都躺在路边马路牙子上，满身都是伤，身下全是血呀，顺着雨水哗哗直淌，雨水都变成了红色。这两个人早已绝气身亡。
Meanwhile, riots against the Japanese were also taking place in Hong Kong.
So at the end of the war, we knew about the war was ending, and the English fleet came in, and they occupied the naval dockyards, and the Japanese were very scared of the Chinese population because the Chinese population wanted to kill them. And so I went out in the street and I joined all the Chinese mobs, trying to, kill Japanese and so on. I was only 8 years old, but, I was part of the mood. So, and the Japanese there'd be about 4 or 5 Japanese soldiers would walk together, but they all had their bayonets sticking in out, to make sure that they could get through. And they would go to the naval dockyard and surrender to the British, because they knew if they surrendered to the population, they'd be dead. And in fact, I saw bodies hanging from lampposts. So not only Japanese, but anybody who collaborated and so on, it was there. So it was a time for revenge, but you can understand that Chinese suffered a lot during the Japanese occupation. So it was easy to understand how much hate and anger they had, so, yeah.
On August 28th, Colonial Secretary Franklin Gibson announced the restoration of British rule, and 2 days later, Hong Kong was formally handed over to the Royal Navy. Peace came back to Hong Kong at last.
When they came, they established order pretty quickly. I was surprised as soon as they arrived that the trams started to run again, because during the war the trams stopped running because there was no coal for electricity, so the trams stopped running. But as soon as the British came, they started the furnaces going. They put electricity. The trams started going. So I think the British got things back to normal fairly quickly.
In 1947, Paul and his brother started school at the Central British School, which opened after the war. It was later renamed King George V School. In the same year, on August 27th, George's second daughter was born. Her name is Nona. 4 months later, George got his naturalization certificate, ending his 30 years of stateless status. And as soon as he became British, he changed his last name from Pilsky to Parks, saying that nobody could pronounce it correctly.
I didn't believe him when he said that either, because it seems so, Piolski is not a hard name to pronounce. It's not like some other Polish name which you can't even spell. But I think he didn't want to be Russian, didn't want to be an emigre, just wanted to be British.
As law and order were quickly restored in Hong Kong by the British, the Soviets were taking over Manchuria city by city. Shan Tianfang, who was living in the capital of Manchuria, was very confused when the Soviets first arrived.
等从第2天开始，苏联的大部队是陆续开到长春市。打那之后，长春所有的一切统统都归苏联红军管理，什么经济啊、财政啊、文化教育啊、行政大权呐、维持治安呐、等等等，全是人家说了算。长春就成立了红军司令部，有什么事儿都得上那儿请示报告去，而且红军也发了告示，告诉从今以后 苏联红军在这就住下了。
6 августа вошла Красная Армия. Япошки капитулировали, и мы, студенты и вообще школьники, больше всего радовались из-за того, что нам не надо эту шерсть сдавать.
Initially, the Soviets were welcomed as liberators. People would invite them into their homes and try to do something nice for them, and the soldiers would respond in kind. But that didn't last very long, and the trust between the two groups quickly disappeared.
Устроили сразу молебен в самом центральном нашем соборе. Там пришло несколько десятков тысяч, а от собора вниз шла улица на вокзал. И вот русские с обоих сторон тысячи стояли и приветствовали с цветами, ура кричали. И вот на этот центральный перед этим собором там стоял еще обелиск японцам. Так вот, там тоже была площадь, и так там их торжественно встретили. И священник даже проповедь сказал, что наши братья пришли нас освободить. А после этого, через 3 дня, начал орудовать СМЕРШ. И начали забирать. И вот армейцы начали в себя закрываться. И начал уже страх.
Shortly after, all hell broke loose in Manchuria.
KGB was working very well, and they took about 11,000 people from Harbin and took them back to Russia, to Siberia. And I've been told my father was shot about 3 months later.
As for the Harbin Russians, 1/4 of the male population were brought back to the USSR, identified as either the anti-Soviets or Japanese spies. They were all put into gulags and later executed. It was said repeatedly so much and for such a long time that Harbin was a nest of white guards. To meet the arrest quota proportionate to a city's reputation like Harbin's, NKVD agents began to arrest many innocent people.
2 недели, да, но остальные же брали и потом увозили очень многих молодых. Знаете почему? Потому что японцы, они вербовали русскую молодежь в свою контрразведку против советских. Им хорошо платили, и это страшно. И почти поголовно всех увезли. Вот так мы жили бедно, так что среди наших как-то я не помню. Только одна Ляля Суринова, ее брата увезли, это я знаю, мама убивалась. А он работал в какой-то японской фирме. Я знаю, что очень многих отвезли, многие вдовы потом поднимали своих детей сами.
During those 9 months of Soviet occupation, Manchuria was devastated. Soviets and Chinese were killing and raping the Japanese. The Japanese were committing mass group suicide, and Soviet soldiers were raping and killing Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans. Countless villages were pillaged and burned. Hundreds of Japanese factories were plundered. As for the things Soviet soldiers couldn't load onto the trains, they destroyed and burned, leaving nothing valuable behind.
Once known as the Pittsburgh of the Orient, Mukden had many large factories now destroyed and their machinery shipped away to Vladivostok. Holes in the factory walls show how some of the plant was carried away.
俄国人先到，把东北的日本人留下的东西都抢走了嘛，奸淫妇女啊，这个都是印象深刻。我刚到沈阳的时候，那满街的妇女都没有头发的，都是剃光头的。
开始啊，穿那个男人衣服，老毛子以为就是男人，就放过去了。后来老毛子也惊了，他就摸了。
那时候东北就是有自卫队呀、警察呀这地方的，他们来了以后就看到什么就要什么。见到女人就是强奸了什么的，所以这个时候整个社会就是大家也不上班也不上学，等于政府停顿。
Among the Soviet-killed Chinese was Lu Dongsheng, the commander of the Songjiang military region of the Northeast People's Autonomous Army, and the commander of the 4th Division of the 2nd Red Army. Lu, a Soviet Union-educated CCP member, followed the Red Army and returned to Manchuria. On the night of November 16, 1945, Lu was shot dead by 2 Soviet soldiers who were looting on the street of Harbin. The behavior of Soviet troops during this period later affected relations between China and Soviet Union. Harbin Russians' attitude towards the Soviets was complicated. The Soviet consulate began to operate, encouraging local Russians to apply. Despite many families losing their husbands and sons to the Red Army, most people applied for a Soviet passport. Because life in Harbin was too hard for the non-Soviets. By then, Vera had graduated from high school and wanted to go to the Harbin Institute of Technology.
Харбинский политехникум до сих пор считается в Китае одним из лучших, которых сейчас 10 во всем Китае, потому что там русские профессора прекрасно поставили всю программу.
Мне очень хотелось, я математика была хорошая, мне хотелось на строительный факультет. Я пришла подавать заявление, они говорят, у вас нет советского гражданства, мы вас не примем. Потому что это уже было в советских руках, высшее учебное заведение. И мне пришлось начать работать. Одна моя знакомая мне выписывала в торговом доме советские газеты, труд и всякое такое на вес. Старые газеты, напротив был китайский рынок. Я туда ныряла и продавала это китайцам на вес. И кое-какие гроши зарабатывала. Вот это была первая моя работа. А потом, потому что я хорошо пела, меня кто-то пригласил послушать меня. И меня приняли из-за того, что в этом торговом доме огромный мужской и женский хор был, и выступали. Им нужна была солистка. И меня приняли туда, как продавщицу готового платья из-за того, что я буду петь в хору. Вот так я начала уже более-менее. И вы знаете, буквально через полгода опять сорвалось. Потому что у меня не было советского гражданства. В тот день уволили поляка, венгра и меня, чешку. Потому что этот торговый дом был в русских руках.
By 1946, almost all Harbin Russians became citizens of the USSR. And when certain newly made Soviet citizens conceived the idea of going to live in the USSR, they were given a brief explanation. Even without them, the people in the Soviet Union had enough of their own white bandits. The elections to the Supreme Soviet, which were always held in the USSR with pomp and festivities, and were compulsory for everyone, were held for the Harbin Russians only once. After the Soviets left Manchuria in 1946, the remaining Harbin Russians were caught in another war. This time it was fought between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek. Many lost their jobs at CER and finally made up their mind to leave. Vera and her father left Harbin in 1949 and later brought the rest of the family to their homeland, Czechoslovakia. Vera was admitted by Charles University, majoring in sinology and the history of the Far East. Since 1958, she has been a Chinese translator. When most of the world was stuck in World War II, Xinjiang was left alone. After the brief unification of China in 1928, it quickly fell back into the regional power struggle. Within 5 years, Xinjiang changed 3 governors. The first one was killed at a Russian college in Urumqi, and the second one, who was pro-Soviet, was overthrown by the White Russians. In the end, the former provincial commander-in-chief, Sheng Shicai, who had the full backing of both the White Russians and Chiang Kai-shek, was confirmed as the de facto ruler of Xinjiang. However, Sheng's position was shaky. At the end of 1933, Sheng Shicai was caught in the middle by the Donggan army led by Ma Zhongying from the north and the Uyghur rebels from the south. Chiang Kai-shek, fighting the Japanese, couldn't send Sheng any troops, so he begged the USSR for help and slaughtered the White Russian leaders who had supported him previously. Sivan Hedin, who was planning highways in Xinjiang for Chiang Kai-shek, ran into this chaos and was captured by both parties.
I was appointed a leader of the great expedition that has been traveling now for 1.5 years in Xinjiang. We happened to plunge into the middle of the war between the Mohammedan General Ma Zhongying and the Dupan, or Governor General of Xinjiang, Sheng Shicai. And we were made prisoners, first by Ma and then by Shen, and kept prisoner for about 1 month. And both parties took our cars and used them for some time, but we got them back again. And we were attacked by bandits several times in very close quarters, but nobody was hurt and nobody was lost on the journey. So the whole expedition...
The Donggan General Ma Zhongying represented a special force in northwest China, the Ma clique. Donggan, or the Hui people, is a group of Chinese-speaking Muslims living mainly in the northwestern and southwestern provinces. They are the descendants of the Han Chinese and Silk Road immigrants, such as Arabs and Iranians, who spread Islam. The Ma clique was begun by those Donggan generals who served in the military of the Qing Empire. 2 generations of their descendants continued it. Their last name, Ma, is a common rendering of the Muslim name Muhammad. After the fall of the Imperial Qing, the Ma clique generals declared their allegiance to the Republic of China, becoming the de facto ruler of China's northwest till 1958. One famous Ma clique general was Ma Zhongying. He joined the militia when he was 14 years old and became a general at the age of 17. While his cousins and uncles were fighting the wars in China proper, Kokonor, and Tibet, the 21-year-old led his army into Xinjiang and quickly became the biggest rival of Sheng Shicai. He and his Donggan soldiers were famous for their anti-Russian sentiment. To them, White Russians and Red Russians were the same. They fought them all regardless. At this 11th hour, the Soviet Union, disturbed by the ongoing turmoil in Xinjiang, finally decided to intervene directly in support of Sheng Shicai. As the Soviet Union became increasingly involved in Xinjiang, the relationship between the Reds and Whites became obscure. At times, they were strong allies, controlling affairs in Xinjiang together. They even fought the local Muslims and Donggans side by side like comrades. With the direct Soviet military intervention, Sheng Shicai put down the revolt in northern and southern Xinjiang. The Donggans were defeated, and Ma Zhongying disappeared from USSR after 1936. He was only 27. In October 1937, Sheng became the de facto ruler of Xinjiang. But the price of his supremacy was to be almost complete domination of Xinjiang by the Soviet Union. A permanent Red Army unit, the 8th Regiment, was established at Kumo to guard against a possible Japanese strike. Intervention from Chiang Kai-shek, the Ma clique that controlled the adjacent provinces, and the local Turkic population, which had shown such an inclination to rebellion. After Rida's family made it to Kuja, the Soviets quickly controlled the city. In 1941, when Rida was 6 years old, another purge of White Russians began. Rida's mother nearly died in the purge and was later sent to Urumqi. Rida, her grandma, and her sister were sent to different prison camps for another 5 years.
Women were taken to one prison. The children at 5 years, until 5 years were taken to the children's commute. And of course, the only about 2 years children were whichever they were safe with the parents. So they were divided into 3 categories. During those years, I spent exactly almost 6-7 years before I was able to see my mother again. The survival was simply zero because children, especially at my age, were dying left and right, to be honest with you.
In 1938, Sheng Shicai went to Moscow, where he became a member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Upon his return to Urumqi, Sheng endorsed every move that Stalin made as World War II unfolded. By 1939, Xinjiang, though still nominally part of China, had become a virtual dependency of the Soviet Union, differing scarcely at all from the neighboring Mongolian People's Republic.
Non-human, what they have done, because the war was raging all around. And most of the time during the afternoon, at those times there were no cars, nothing, because only the cows and the horses, the buggy horse or the cow buggies. When the war was raging, the dead people who were the soldiers, they were taken on those, by the horses and by the cows' buggies. We were taken into the streets, lined up on the streets, to be shown that this is the dead body of the so-called White Russians who are against the communism, and these are the Belaruski, as they're called, Belobandita, the white bandits of the Russians. Now you can see them, that they're all killed and they will be buried. We were shown this day in, day out for years and years, and I still sometimes, even in my dreams, I can remember that.
However, the honeymoon was to last only a short time. 3 events happened in 1941, which resulted in Sheng's loyalty shifting away from the Soviets and back to Chiang Kai-shek. In April, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Japan. In June, Hitler invaded the USSR. In December, the United States entered the war on the side of the Republic of China. The combined effect of this development was to convince Sheng, staunchly anti-Japanese and ever the pragmatist, that the Soviets were no longer a desirable ally. Talks between Sheng Shicai and the Nanjing government began in March 1942. By October, the negotiations were complete, and Xinjiang was once again allied with the Republic of China. Sheng quickly carried out a purge of all pro-Soviet elements in the province. Among those tortured and executed was Mao Zedong's younger brother, Mao Zemin. In June 1943, Chiang Kai-shek's army began to enter Xinjiang. 4 months later, the Soviets had completely withdrawn from the province. As Soviet influence weakened in the region, Rita's family fled Xinjiang.
In the afternoon, some news came, and they said, "Be ready for tonight. At night, midnight, we will come and pick you up to take you to the airplane." And at that time, there was an American mission, military mission. My mother used to work there, apparently. So somehow they managed to organize that my mother, myself, only 3 people were able to be taken on their military plane. And we were sneaked out at night, about midnight again, into that military plane and brought into Lanzhou. We arrived to Lanzhou. From Lanzhou, we managed to get to Shanghai. In Shanghai, for the first time, it was a huge city, I remember, and it was beautiful, as a matter of fact, comparing to the prison camps and all this wilderness and so on and so on. Shanghai is the first stop which begins finally, if I can use or can say, a free world.
The conflicts and skirmishes in Xinjiang continued until the Chinese Communist Party's victory in 1949. On September 24th, Chiang Kai-shek's army in Xinjiang surrendered. 6 days later, the People's Republic of China, PRC, was proclaimed in Beijing. The one-century chaos was finally over.
中华人民共和国中央人民政府通过中华人民共和国中央人民政府委员会18日在首都就职。以此决议，最高中华人民共和国中央人民政府的成立。
One of the pilots flying over the crowd was Lin Hu. He just graduated from China's first aviation school a few months ago and was invited to fly in the first National Day Parade.
我接周总理2次到南苑去，朱老总也去，就看我们。有一次去看的时候呢，朱老总就提出来，说这一次咱们开国大典呢，既然有了飞机了，有了作战部队了，能不能参加检阅？给我们队长一讲呢，大家都很高兴，说能参加开国大典的检阅，当然这是非常荣幸的事情。说但是这个事情要训练一下，要确有把握才行。大概在9月初就开始了训练。训练一段过程啊，请军委的领导同志去看一下行不行？我们就编成这个战斗机啊，我们9架战斗机，3架飞机一队，3架飞机一队。让战斗机通过这个机场跑道，他们在下边搞了一张桌子，铺了红布，看着飞机通过。看了很高兴，下来说飞得不错，说能不能把飞机再搞多一点？说战斗机多一点恐怕有困难，我们当时能修好的就是9架。说别什么飞机都行。好，那我们就凑，说能凑多少架飞机多少架飞机。后来我们又凑了2架，就是刚才说的轰炸机，2架温室，有3架运输机，这个西46。又凑了3架呢，教练机，小教练机，还有个通讯机，美国的叫 L5，对，这样凑起来一共这个17架飞机。
The communist victory, however, was a worrying sign for the Shanghai Russians, who feared Mao would send them back to USSR to be executed. By then, Rita had already been in Shanghai for almost 3 years. She was staying in a monastery built by Saint John of Shanghai and San Francisco, the spiritual leader of the Russian refugees. In 1934, Saint John was ordained as the bishop of the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia. Making contact with all the various groups, he quickly became involved in local charitable institutions and founded an orphanage and home for the children of the destitute.
We stayed in the monastery for about almost 2.5 years with Vladika Shanghaiski, or John. Again, I would say here again begins the new chapter of life, that there is still a hope of humanity, because Vladika Shanghaiski made very, very clear to all these newcomers, because not only just 2 of us, but many others. Altogether, there were 300 children, most of them without parents. I think we were still lucky that we still had our mother. This is the generation, our generation, of what was left from the misery of the Soviet Union invasion and execution. During those 2.5 years, there is a future that's something to look into grow and to grow up as a human being and not as a killer. As I've been telling you before, that I could have been a perfect machine killer.
When the communists took power in China in 1949, the Russian refugees were forced to flee. The International Refugee Organization settled them on the island of Tubabo in the Philippines. St. John stayed with the refugees and talked to various organizations to ensure his people would be accepted. Surrender of Japan was a big relief for its neighbors. Among them was a country south of the Indonesian border, the Commonwealth of Australia.
Australia, the great sunny continent of the southern seas, over 30 times the size of Great Britain, yet with a population of less than that of London. 98% are of British stock. A bright, young country with lots to live for. We welcome you to share its great future.
However, not everyone was welcome to Australia's sunny shores.
These are the people we want, and the more of them, the better.
The invitation to come down under was extended only to British and white people. For much of the 20th century, successive Australian governments deported and barred entry to anyone whose race they considered undesirable. It was known as the White Australia policy.
Think of the White Australia policy?
Well, I think it's good, and they should really have it and keep out the coloured races.
That in itself is good. It should be continued.
What do I think of it? I think it's very good.
We should keep our country, let's say, as white as possible.
Oh, well, no, I don't think it's fair.
Do I think that the policy is wise? No, I don't.
Keep them out. Keep all the niggers out. Japs and everybody.
Right.
Well, we don't want them.
But on the other hand, it is an open manifestation of racial discrimination. And that in itself, of course, is inhuman.
The Second World War threatened the very existence of Australia by force. Australian troops by 1942 were almost all in Europe, fighting for Mother England. As Japan's bombers struck the northern town of Darwin, Australia and its people were left defenseless. After World War II, Australia realized that it was in urgent need of a larger population for defense and development.
I am going abroad to seek ships for immigrants. If we have no ships, we shall get no immigrants. And without immigration, the future of the Australia we know will be both uneasy and brief.
Based on their skin color, Russians were desirable for the Australian Immigration Office. But as the Cold War unfolded, the new conservative government led by Robert Menzies widened the spectrum of White Australia policy, adding another unacceptable color.
This is not a question of color or race. It's a question of the maintenance of democratic freedom.
Menzies firmly believed Australia was now threatened by international communism. In this Cold War atmosphere, anyone entering Australia could be a foreign spy. The inspection of the newly arrived Russian Chinese was harsh. They were not trusted and were often perceived as Soviet spies. Many were not allowed to enter, and those who went to Australia would be given only the most unattractive work, the jobs Australians didn't want. To get more white laborers, Australia sent people to Tubabo Island at the end of March 1949. They were mainly interested in young and healthy men, ready for any physical labor. After quickly processing people suitable for them, the Australians issued entry visas on the spot. However, applicants were required to sign a blank piece of paper obliging them to work for 2 years at an unknown enterprise. Despite the doubts and confusion of obtaining an Australian visa, more than 1,000 Shanghai Russians signed up to immigrate to Australia. The French immigration officers arrived at the camp 2 months later. Less than 100 people signed up to leave for France. More than 100 people immigrated to South America. Rita's family was among them. They first went to Paraguay and later moved to America. The rest of the Russians on Tobago Island were rescued by the US in 1950. Some Hong Kong Russians figured out a different way of living.
I was used to doing things for the family, organize things and so on. Then my father, in 1953, he decided that, again, this time he was serious. He wanted to go back to the Soviet Union to help Stalin rebuild. And at that stage, I was right wing, if you like. I just discovered a woman called Ayn Rand. She's a woman who wrote The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. She was the fairy godmother of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. She was the neoliberalism and so on. So I just discovered Ayn Rand. So I was very sympathetic to her. And my father was a Stalinist through and through. So we loved each other, father and son, we loved each other, but we had some very interesting political discussions, So he wanted to go to the Soviet Union. I didn't. I asked my mother, did she want to go? She said, no, she didn't like the idea. I asked my brother, he didn't want to go as well. So I was the only Catholic in the family, and the Catholic Church helped us a lot during the war and so on. We lived in Italian convent during the war because of me and so on, so it saved us a lot. So I went to the Catholic Refugee Organization and I said, look, I'm a Catholic, but this family of mine, they're heathens, they're Russian Orthodox, they're not Catholics. So if you get us to the United States, I'll get them converted to Catholicism. They laughed, they thought it was a good idea, but I'm sorry, we can't get you to the United States. It's something to do with the 1912 Immigration Act, so there's no chance. So I said, well, okay, what about Canada? Vancouver is supposed to be a very nice place. What about Vancouver? And again, for some reason or other, Vancouver wasn't available as well. So they then said to me, what about Australia? And I said, what, where? And they said, kangaroos, koala bears. Oh, yeah, down under, yeah. So I then went back to my mother and father and said to them, listen, I can organize for us to go to Australia. They'll lend us the money to go there and we'll pay them back. So my father very reluctantly agreed, and my mother was really happy. So that's how we ended up in Australia rather than the Soviet Union or the US or whatever, So I was a little Boy Scout organizer, at an early age.
Paul and his father boarded a converted Liberty ship and set sail for Australia. They arrived in Sydney in April 1953. Coming in through the Head and steaming under the Sydney Harbour Bridge, Paul fell in love with the city and its magnificent harbour. That stretch of water was to become an inspiration for many of his paintings in the years to come. After the war, George ended his musical career and started a new one.
I think he realized that having a family with 2 children now was difficult for him, it wasn't a secure job. So if he was playing at the Hong Kong Hotel or whatever, or Repulse Bay, that was until the contract ended, and then he'd have to renegotiate with his orchestra for another contract. So he saw an ad for Hong Kong Tramways, and they wanted European inspectors. So he applied and he got the job. And then he became, he was put onto, after 2 years, I think he was put onto the staff and became the welfare manager. So he used to look after the welfare of the tram personnel. He enjoyed that, and in 1953 we all went on 9 months leave, and then every 4 years we'd have 8 months leave. So it was fantastic. My mother was manageress of Peckeret's in Central. It was right next door to Lane Crawford's. And so she'd bring home dresses that she wanted me to wear. So I was kept in dresses by her.
George and Lila lived in Hong Kong happily until their retirement. Meanwhile, the happy days for Madame Chang were officially over.
In a few days, I shall be returning to China. Not to Nanking, Chongqing, Shanghai, or Canton. Not to the soil of our mainland. I shall return to my people on the island of Formosa, the fortress of our hopes, the citadel of our battle against an alien power which is ravaging our country.
Russia will never know one day of peace in China. Russia will never own China. China will remain free.
My husband remains resolute to lead his people against the alien invaders and their alien ideas. Goodbye, my friends, and thank you.
Her husband tried and failed, and Madame Chang, for the rest of her life, never returned to mainland China. "1949 was an important year for communism. On June 24th, Kim Il-sung became the chairman of the Workers' Party of Korea. On August 29th, the USSR successfully tested its first atomic bomb. On October 1st, the People's Republic of China was proclaimed. 6 days later, East Germany was established. Mao turned 56 that year, still a young leader eager to rebuild his torn-up country and make alliances. The newly established People's Republic of China looked to the Soviet Union to help transform it into a world power. 2 months after he declared the founding of the PRC, Mao embarked on his first international trip, a 2-month visit to the USSR, to establish a diplomatic alliance with Stalin.
亲爱的同志们和朋友们，我这次我有机会访问世界上第一个伟大社会主义国家周年的首都，是生命很愉快的事。
He was then invited to Stalin's lavish birthday party.
Вам пожелать счастливых лет, учитель, Бог и друг любимый, родному Сталину. Детство счастливое наше, нет юности в мире дети, прекрасно. Мы вам обещаем отлично учиться. Забыть на свете была единица. Мы сегодня пионеры. Завтра будем инженеры, трактористы, врачи, столевары, искачи, агрономы, педагоги. Нам открыты все дороги, все пути. Только знай себе, расти.
Despite the high tensions between the two countries, on February 14th, Valentine's Day of 1950, the two countries signed a formal alliance. Stalin tilted the treaty's term against China's favor, which planted the seeds of mistrust. Almost all the Soviet loans under the treaty would be for purchasing Soviet arms. In addition, the treaty gives the Soviets exclusive access to Xinjiang and Manchuria economies. Mao found China caught in an unequal relationship. 4 months after Mao's trip to the Soviet Union, in June 1950, Kim Il-sung invaded South Korea, and a war broke out between the Soviet-backed North and American-backed South.
The Soviet Union attempted to extend its control over other peoples. It embarked on a new colonialism. Soviet style. This new colonialism has already brought under its complete control and exploitation many countries which used to be free countries. We must continue to increase our production for military purposes, because Soviet policies leave us no other choice.
Unwilling to risk a direct confrontation with the Americans, Stalin requested for Mao to intervene. Mao decided to play the situation to China's advantage. He demanded that Stalin provide military aid and air cover for his troops. Mao said this war would be an equal partnership, and he was confident that the US and the UN troops would eventually be driven out of the Korean peninsula.
时间要打多久？我讲我们不要做决定。过去是由到了门，以后是由20号月或者美国的将来的什么总统由他们去决定。就是说，他们要打多久就打多久。一次打到会战胜利。
Mao ordered over a quarter of a million troops into Korea. Stalin deployed airplanes to Manchuria to defend her coastal regions. But Stalin stopped short. He decided not to send planes to Korea. As a result, Mao's outgunned army faced the UN war machine alone. Lin Hu, representing China's less than a year-old Air Force, joined the Korean War as the deputy regiment commander.
过去我们打地面战斗，我们参加了很多了。这空战究竟怎么打？我们飞行员才飞了60个小时，最多的像我们这算老一点飞行员80个小时，而美国的飞行员呢，至少飞了3000个小时，都是第2次世界大战的这个老飞行员。那么他投入了空军呢，一共投入1100多架飞机。我们当时的2个旅，就3旅、4旅，一共多少架？不到200架飞机。
Still, he shot down an F-86 Sabre and damaged another. But it didn't change the fact that the Chinese soldiers were being slaughtered by the enemy planes with little to no air protection. Once, when Lin Hu was on his way back to the base for refueling, the enemy targeted his plane.
那个失误有个弱点，就你到空中作战以后超过45分钟啊，油料就不行了，就必须返航落地。我在返航落地的时候，2个F-86他们这个飞机打坏了，那在海上啊，那你看朝鲜地图就是跳伞大概在3000米以上吧。2个F-86还打我这个伞，他6挺机关炮啊，12辆起的打我这个，我们好多飞行员就是那样被他们伞也开了，也落地了，但是下来以后没有胳膊了，没有腿了，没有脑袋了。都这样牺牲。
Lin Hu was luckier than his friends. He survived the machine guns and landed on the sea.
后来反正那朝鲜老百姓啊，还有军队啊，把我拉上岸，拉上去了以后，开始把我当美国人嘛。就开枪要的，把我什么衣服都脱了，就剩了个裤衩，就这样。后来他们发现我这个兜里头有中朝人民联合空军，飞行员，还有1500块被朝鲜的货币。他那个军队里头有我们4野回去的几个干部。他们就是说这不要打，说这是中朝人民联合空军，这样他们又跑回去弄小学生上课的 那个板凳后边有个靠，把我皮夹克什么又给我，但手枪他拿走了。这个腿啊，这个左腿就不行了。
Eventually, the North Koreans let him go and sent him back to China. Throughout the war, Mao sent 73% of Chinese infantry troops, nearly 3 million soldiers, to serve in Korea, along with more than 600,000 civil workers, more than 52% of the Chinese Air Force, 55% of the tank units, 67% of the artillery divisions, and 100% of the railroad engineering divisions were also sent to Korea. Chinese soldiers who served in Korea were more likely to be killed than those who served in World War II or the Chinese Civil War. The war also cost China 10 billion yuan, owed $1.3 billion to the Soviet Union, and forever interrupted Mao's plan to conquer Taiwan. In contrast, Stalin sent 72,000 soldiers, mostly pilots, flying near the China-North Korea border, far from the battlefield.
Теперь, когда от Китая и Кореи до Чехословакии и Венгрии появились новые ударные бригады в лице народно-демократических стран, теперь нашей партии легче стало бороться. Да, и работа пошла веселее.
3 years into the war, on March 5th, Stalin passed away. Within months, a ceasefire was called. Korea is divided into 2 parts. At least 25,000 Chinese soldiers went missing in Korea, and more than 183,000 died. Among them was Chairman Mao's 28-year-old son, whose body was reportedly burned beyond recognition. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, lost 282 men. All hell was about to break loose for every Russian in China.